Hey everyone, welcome back to the Direct-to-Video Connoisseur podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and I am joined once again by Scott Murphy from the All 90s Action All the Time podcast and the New Horror Express podcast. Welcome back, Scott.
Well, thanks for having me back. Good to be back.
Yeah, I think this might have been the cleanest opening I've done in a long time. Usually I'm like fumbling over like how I'm going to introduce the other person, so I feel a little bit confident I did a good job this time for once. So yeah.
Seemed very smooth to me, so yeah, good job.
Yeah, I planned it out a bit more. Yeah, it's speaking of openings, the last time you were on, I think we were trying to do the math out. We think we recorded it maybe in like mid-November when the World Cup had just started. It was the group stages of the World Cup, and we were talking about the World Cup at that time and sort of like, talking about how we thought it might go, who might win. If Argentina won, I might get a special hamburger at the Hard Rock Cafe here, all of that kind of stuff. The episode didn't post until well after the World Cup had happened. And so it was kind of a funny conversation to, I guess that kind of sometimes happens with podcasting, that you record it well in advance, and then what happens comes much, the episode airs after whatever happened already happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the problem of talking about any contemporary news when you are recording a podcast, because it's it's the same with my podcast. Many of my podcasts are done well in advance of when they're actually posted. Sometimes a month or two in advance, and sometimes we might mention something that's currently in the news or whatever, and it's well out of date, and people will be like, "Oh yeah, that thing happened." So I was quite amused when the episode came out, and I'm sure a few of your listeners might have been quite confused. Maybe they thought they'd accidentally tuned into Guardian Football Weekly.
It's one of those things. I always, because I'm not really great with the editing of the podcast process. Like I will edit things sometimes. Like for example, if somebody has a coughing fit or something like that, I might, edit that piece out there or something, usually, because usually the guests that I have on, knock on wood, we usually don't say anything that's like so inflammatory that's like, oh, we better cut that out. That might not be good for the podcast. So I'm usually only editing maybe if there's like a silence, or I'll kind of maybe smooth out the sound. Like if maybe in the past before I was using the microphone I'm using now, my audio was always a lot lower than the guest's audio, and so I would try to edit that out. But in terms of taking any of the pieces out, I usually just kind of keep it. I know John Cross from After We Diner, he's been on, and we've talked about things like the night buses in London and the equivalent here in Philadelphia, and how you're kind of taking your life into your own hands when you ride one of those at 2 or 3 in the morning. Just sort of stays in. So I probably have to get to the habit of doing the timestamps that people do in the descriptions, so that someone will know the actual movie conversation is going to start at this point. But again, I'm still kind of new to this. I'm still kind of raw with the podcasting thing, and I just kind of just sort of put it out there, and there you go. There's the episode.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not an editing expert myself, so I can't say anything that way. And again, I'm quite a light editor. I don't edit out as much as many other people that I know edit out. I particularly when I'm doing the New Horror Express, mainly I'm just looking a little bit for kind of my ums and ahs. I tend to and ah a bit and maybe repeat myself a little bit. So I try and edit that out. And if the guest is doing the same thing, I might edit that out as well. But other than that, I'm not doing a lot of skillful editing things that I know that a lot of my podcasting contemporaries do. So I'm kind of on a similar wavelength as similar boat, and I don't mind kind of wacky tangents. I think both my podcasts, All 90s Action All the Time and New Horror Express, are known for some of the wacky tangents that they go on. But we do talk about the subject as well. So I don't want to shit on my podcast too much, because if you because I still think they're good. They're good. They might not be the best podcast in the world, but I still think they're solid. And if anybody's listening to this wants to check them out, I'd be happy for that to happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I like as myself having been a guest and listened to other episodes, I could definitely attest to that for All 90s Action and for New Horror Express. And yeah, I think it's the tangents. I think they're kind of what makes the podcast medium fun. I think, if you're on an actual show, right, you've got these beats you've got to hit because commercials come in and all of those kinds of things. Whereas like a podcast, you can sort of get out there and let it flow a little bit. And so that is part of the fun of it for sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I definitely I definitely think it's good that I'm not at the state. I don't have the downloads. I don't have the kind of prestige that I can attract advertisers or anything like that. So I'm not. I don't have to kind of uh, report to anybody. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. No, and I always joke about that like, yeah, if I get paid like Joe Rogan, or even like a fraction of what Joe Rogan gets paid to do a podcast, then maybe, right, like if podcasting could be, the full-time thing, that's like, okay, I'm getting my living is off of podcasting, then yeah, for sure, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to invest in all the best equipment and do all the, all of that kind of stuff, like you said. And that's one thing. But I think with this, it still can have, like you said, it still has like a good a quality vibe to it that, like, it, like you said, it doesn't need to be edited for commercials and those kinds of things, but it's still, yeah, like you said, it still sticks to the topic and it's still worth listening to. Still a fun listen. I think, All 90s Action All the Time and New Horror Express are definitely fun listens, and same with, I hope the same with my podcast as well. People seem to enjoy it as well. That, yeah, even though we don't completely edit everything out, we still, I listen to other podcasts that do have, like, that are backed by like Spotify. There's the Ringer podcast network, that's a sports one here in the United States. They do very long form conversations. Their episodes are usually 2+ hours long. And yeah, they don't really cut anything. They have commercials, of course. They take breaks and have commercials, but so, of course they and they also do the timestamps, and they're not very accurate. So I don't feel so bad. If we do a 30-minute conversation on the state of football, and I don't feel as bad when I know that some professional ones out there that's what they do for work have conversations like that and still just leave them in as well.
Yeah, because a lot of professional podcasts are still relatively rambling. I
Yeah.
mean, and kind of the sports ones. Some of them go on for ages. Like Ariel Hawani has a podcast, and often his podcasts are like 3 hours long. Like Ariel Hawani is like a MMA journalist, I guess.
Yeah.
In case your listeners don't know. So yeah, and often, sometimes I listen to like kind of part of them or something because like I'm an MMA fan, but sometimes they are quite exhausting to get through.
Yeah, and I think Ariel Hawani, I think his podcast is part of the Ringer network. If it's not, no, he's on. Oh, his is on it's on DraftKings, so that's not, because Ringer is owned by. It's funny. All the podcasts here in the United States, they're either sponsored by one of the two main online and FanDuel. So the Ringer one that I listen to, because I've heard Ariel Hawani on there, but yeah, he's on a different, SB Nation is his podcasting network. But yeah, I know what you mean, because I've heard him on some other ones. I know Ariel because he's been on some of those Ringer ones that I listen to, but also I know that he's kind of he's not a controversial one. He's controversial, I think, as far as Dana White goes. I think Dana White's not a big fan of him, but he like you said, he definitely has some good information on MMA fighters and the MMA scene.
Oh yeah, he definitely does, and like he's controversial to Dana White because like Dana White doesn't like any journalist who does actual journalism. Doesn't just write lovely puff pieces about the UFC. But anyway, right. You said we don't do controversial topics on, right, yes. So like I'll not say anything litigious about okay. Dana White. We'll move on to all the litigious things that we can say about Steven Seagal.
That's right, exactly. Well, that's a great segue, actually, the MMA Steven Seagal thing, because he was known for he kind of bragged about helping Anderson Silva win a match that turns out Anderson Silva and his camp said, Seagal maybe didn't have as much to do with it as Seagal thinks he did. It's one of the interesting things, actually, as we transition here. A lot of people have kind of followed a similar track that you have as a guest on the podcast, where first episode we do a Dolph podcast, and then the second episode we do a Seagal movie. And The interesting thing about Seagal is he used to always be like the number two one in terms of moving the needle, when it came to podcast subjects for this show. Dolph was always number one, Seagal number two. Lately, it seems like Bruce Willis is starting to kind of surpass Seagal. If we talk about a Bruce Willis movie, it seems like that's one that people are always interested in. But Seagal has still always been kind of firmly there. And when you mentioned wanting to do a Seagal movie, I'm always up for it. I'm always interested in that. But I figured maybe before we started, Scott, maybe if you give us, what are your thoughts on kind of Seagal overall?
So I feel like the last time I was on this podcast, when you asked me about like my relationship to Dolph, I gave a rather long answer, and I have a kind of rather long answer for this, but I'll try and condense it down as much as possible. So I feel like my kind of fandom of Seagal has gone through several stages. Stage one is when I was a kid. When I was introduced to him, I was about 10 or 11. I thought he was really cool. He looked cool. He did badass moves. He seemed to stick up for the underdog. So I was attracted to that. And also I was a big martial arts movie fan. So like that was all good. And then kind of stage two, I got into my mid-teens. I learned a bit more about Seagal, the man, and realized he is he's up there with Trump and Hulk Hogan as one of history's greatest liars. So my fandom became more ironic. And then I started to notice that like the kind of absurdities of like Seagal films and like all the kind of Seagal kind of tropes that happen. And we'll probably talk a bit about that more when we talk about the movie. But also just like all the things he just kind of lies about or exaggerates, even his actual compliments. He always exaggerates something on top. He just seemed like a weird guy. So like I was like, oh, this is this kind of absurd and fun. And I noticed the kind of ridiculousness of them. And then I guess I kind of tailed off from Seagal. And there was a period where I just didn't really watch his movies and didn't really think about him unless he like popped up in the news, kind of hanging out with Putin, doing weird dances, eating carrots strange, like those things. And then more recently, I did the first season of All 90s Action All the Time about Seagal, because like I was like, I really love these movies, particularly the likes of Under Siege and Out for Justice and Hard to Kill and these kind of things that I've watched multiple times over the years and I still really enjoy to this day. And so I was like, oh, we'll do the first season about him, because for me, like I would say probably my favorite action stars when I was growing up were probably the likes of Arnie and Jackie Chan. But like similarly, the 90s were really defined by like Van Damme and Seagal. So I was like, oh, it makes sense. So we'll do that. And then I kind of researched more into him. And I was aware that he was kind of a jerk and a liar and stuff like that. But there's lots of action stars that have problematic elements to them that I'm like, well, I can still enjoy the films while thinking they're not exactly the best people in the world. And it was kind of the same with Seagal. Then when I was doing the research for the season, I learned about all the kind of sexual harassment and sexual assault claims. And then I was like, oh God, can I still like go ahead with the season? I'm not sure I'm as comfortable with the separation as I was. But then in the end, I did go ahead with the season. I kind of gave a little chat at the start of the season where I was like, I know that some people like Seagal's like a no-go now, and I understand and respect that, but we decided to go ahead with the season because while we can say that he's a terrible person, there's still some enjoyment to have with these films in my personal opinion. And that's the kind of 4 stages of my relationship with Seagal. And I know that's an incredibly long answer. I tried to get through it as quickly as possible, but that's your answer.
Yeah, no, actually, I don't think it was too long. I think it actually mirrors a lot of people's experiences with Seagal, because it's very interesting. Kind of, you talk about a lot of the problematic aspects, and for me, like there's certain people that I like. Just full disclosure, there have been people who have said to me like, I don't want to do Seagal. I don't want to talk about Seagal because of the issues that you brought up. And I think one of the interesting things is like there are people that I generally stay away from, like Mel Gibson's one I try to avoid. And on my last podcast episode, we were talking about movies that had Kevin Dillon or Johnny Drama in him. One of them was Mel Gibson. And in that situation, what I decided to do was like bring up what was bad about Mel Gibson and then talk about the film. And so it's like that idea of like, everybody talks about whether you can separate the art from the artist, and it's more like not separating but more like kind of laying them side by side and saying like, we're gonna, and part of it with Mel Gibson, right, is the only reason why we're even seeing Mel Gibson in DTV films is because he's, blatant anti-Semite, chauvinist, racist, all kind of homophobe, all those kind of things. But another one is Jim Brown. Initially I'd kind of like been like, okay, Jim Brown, I liked him as an actor, but I knew there was the domestic violence stuff. And then the Secrets of the Playboy Mansion comes out, and it turns out he's one of the worst in terms of how the women were treated there. He did some of the worst things, and it's like, okay, so now it's kind of one of those things where I'll review his movies that he's in and just not really mention him in them and not go over him. But same idea, like how do you parse that? Seagal, I think, just like you, as you were going through your 4 stages of fandom with Seagal, I think part of the reason why Seagal is one that it's not that people forgive his transgressions, but people watch his movies, like you said, almost ironically, or even like in this goofy way of like, we're not taking the movie seriously. We're not looking at it as like, what a great job Seagal's doing in this movie. And I think there's almost a sense of like, because we're not watching the movie to celebrate him, that it's a little bit different than if we were celebrating his career. And I think that's probably why, like we know all of those, like you said, all those problematic things, but it's like when we're doing Seagal, it's a little bit better because of that fact that we're not celebrating him. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's true. I think I want to agree with you on kind of 2 separate elements you brought up there. I think it is about laying it side by side. So when we were going through the Seagal season, if there was something problematic that came up in that production, then we would mention it we would try to mention it in the episode and maybe discuss it a little bit before like really getting into the film, or like in between us like getting into the film. So it was like, oh, here's this film, we're talking about this film. This is what Seagal did. He creepy casting couch behavior with Jenny McCarthy, or whatever it was on any, or he beat up John Leguizamo in this one, whatever. And then we discussed like the things that are kind of terrible about it, but also discuss like the things about the film. Now, maybe some of the transitions of that were awkward, and I don't know how that is to listen to from an outside perspective. We tried to do it as respectfully as we possibly could to the basically the crimes that that were that happened on set. So like so hopefully that came across well. And the second aspect that you were talking about it seems easier to separate because we're not celebrating them. I think that's true as well, because I still, I bought, when I was doing the Seagal season, I bought the Seagalology book, and I hadn't visited a lot of his DTV stuff. I basically stopped watching Seagal movies by the time of about Belly of the Beast. So we're talking like 2003.
Yeah.
And then I didn't really watch any other Seagal movies apart from his appearance in Machete, and I watched some episodes of Lawman. That was kind of it for my Seagal viewing. So basically all my viewing was from the 90s. And the couple of films in the early 2000s. And then after buying the Seagalology book, when I was doing the season, I watched some of his DTV stuff more recently. And I can still kind of watch them, and I can still kind of have fun with them. And because it's like it's an ironic fandom. I'm like because these movies are absurd, and he is absurd because no person in human history has taken himself as seriously as Steven Seagal. So I can still kind of enjoy them from that way. And if I was celebrating him, I don't know, given the accusations that have been made against him, if I could watch his films. If I was genuinely a fan and I was genuinely celebrating his work. Like, for example, I no longer listen to the music of Marilyn Manson. Now, when I was a teenager, Marilyn Manson was a real idol for me. He's, like for a lot of people who see themselves as kind of misfit teenagers, Marilyn Manson was somebody that a lot of people in the late 90s, early 2000s, like myself, I turned 15 in the year 2000. that people like myself who were bullied, who saw themselves as misfits or freaks or whatever, looked up to Marilyn Manson and enjoyed his music. Now, what has come out about Marilyn Manson in recent years has completely soiled that, and I now fuck him. I don't want to listen to music. I don't want anything to do with him. I just can't. And that's because, like, for years I celebrated his music and the man, and so I think there is a big difference there. It does lead to a big difference. So that the kind of more ironic fandom.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think, using Marilyn Manson, I think, is a great example, because is it the first John Wick movie that uses the Marilyn Manson song?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I just, full disclosure, I tend to be very late when it comes to movies like that, and so I think it was like the last fall, like last like December maybe, that I finally watched all three of the John Wick movies, and I think that was the one that had the Marilyn Manson song, and I was kind of like, oh, like it kind of had a kind of a visceral sound to it, again, because again, like a lot of the things, I mean, the stuff that came out about him is not, it's really, it's some of the worst stuff, and so yeah,
I mean, it's really horrific. The things that have come out about him are just beyond horrific.
Yeah, so yeah, it was a movie called Killing Strangers. That's right. Their song called Killing Strangers with John Wick, and it's like one of those things where, and granted, the movie came out in the mid 2000s, and so at that point, I think a lot of the stuff about Marilyn Manson was kind of, it was there, kind of the same way with like Bill Cosby. The stuff was there, but or Woody Allen, the things were there, but they weren't like as known, like so firmly as they were, as they've become to be known. And so that's the other thing too with the movie like John Wick, is you kind of just sort of like, okay, that song's there, I don't want to, it's, I'm hearing Manson, it's giving me that kind of visceral reaction, and I'll just kind of ignore it and kind of go on with the movie. But like you said, there's no way to ironically listen to Marilyn Manson, right? Like you can't listen to a Marilyn Manson song and be like, I'm going to make fun of the fact that that's not him doing his reverse shot, right? Or that, like, he's got like this goofy hairstyle, or that he's using like a fake Cajun accent when he's talking. Like all of those kinds of things, you can't really enjoy Marilyn Manson that way. You either like the music or you don't. Whereas with this Seagal stuff, like we're going to get into so many different goofy things that happen in this movie that, yeah, it does make it a little bit better. I mean, granted, Seagal's still getting money. I mean, he doesn't get money from us watching it. He already got paid his money for the movie. So I guess there's that part of it too, that we don't have to feel so bad. But, it's the other part of it, right? Is this idea that, on the other hand, right, that Seagal on the cover does get a certain amount of streams, which that's something I think we'll get into as well, is sort of the law of diminishing returns with his films and having so many of them out there. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that's always going to probably be the case with Seagal, maybe more than any of these problematic figures, is that I think with the problematic ones like a Mel Gibson, people, either just decide they're going to do that whole idea of, I'm going to just watch it and not care about the fact that it's that Mel Gibson has done all of these things and said all of these things and all of that. And they're just going to watch him in the role and enjoy the role, and they're going to parse it that way. With Seagal, you don't really have to do that with these movies because they're so bad. You don't have to make any kind of compromise, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I guess maybe I'll do like a quick synopsis. Maybe is that maybe the best thing we'll do. Now, one thing I did want to mention about the title of the film, The Keeper. I don't know if in the 90s you had the Foster's Australian lager, Australian for beer commercials in the UK.
I don't know if we had the same one. I mean, like Foster's is widely available in the UK, but like I don't know if we had the same ones. Usually we get different adverts than America gets, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, so we had these ads where what would happen is like you'd get something on the screen. Essentially, it would be like what this lingo would mean in Australia. So like, for example, one commercial had like a Australian rules football scrum, where at the end of it, some guy is planted headfirst into the ground. So only his feet are kind of appearing above the ground. And on the screen, it said fertilizer, and so it's like, and then it's like, Foster's Australian for beer, so that was kind of the joke, is that Foster's is Australian for beer. And then here's these other things that are Australian language. So yeah, so that was an ad campaign that was very popular here in the United States. Everybody got a kick out of it. And then of course, one of the jokes was a lot of people didn't like Foster's, so they'd be like, "Foster's, Australian for piss." That was always that for people that weren't fans of Foster's. But one of the ones that I remember very clearly was there's a couple on a first date. They're at the bar waiting for their table, and the maitre d' says, "Okay, your table's ready." They get up to go, and the man is taking his beer with him, but he's leaving the can behind. So the woman goes, "Oi!" And she takes the can, dumps the very little bit that's left into his glass, and then smashes the can against her head. And she's like, "All right, you ready?" And he's like, "Absolutely." And then on the screen it goes, "Keeper." And so whenever I see the keeper, I just think of that commercial, "Keeper, the keeper." So so that's just a little bit of a joke there about that. So.
It's brilliant. No, I don't remember that being on in the UK when I was growing up. So like that was maybe just an American thing, but that's quite funny.
Yeah, there's kind of a thing in America. I think post Crocodile Dundee, there's sort of that whole like Australian, kind of Outback. There's the Outback Steakhouse chain that we have here in the United States. I don't know if that exists anywhere else either. That's supposed to be like Australian, like, I don't know, it's like steak, and it's like kind of a lot of surf and turf kind of thing, steak and then shrimp on the barbie kind of thing.
So. we had something similar that I now can't remember the name of. I think it was called Walkabout. I think like that was our kind of like, and it was like a kind of Aussie themed restaurant where you could get like crocodile steak and kangaroo burger and like stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what those ads were. Those Foster's ads were playing up on. And so I mean, it was one of those kind of things that in that period in the late 90s, early 2000s, like because I was just old enough to drink in the United States around that time, like in the early 2000s. But even like college parties, of course, someone would get you beer. There were always a few people that would have like that big Foster's can, and then I think some people would drink it just because they got a kick out of the commercials, and it did enough to kind of like build the brand here. But I don't know. I mean, I imagine you can still buy Foster's here, but they don't have they don't have those commercials like they used to.
Yeah. Of course, it's funny because it's like one of those things that, and I don't know, listeners, we will get to the film just very, very soon. Right. And we'll make this last point and then we'll get right into it. But I think like Foster's in Australia is kind of seen as like a kind of low class beer.
Yeah.
It's a bit like probably the most famous beer from Scotland is Tennent's, and it is seen as like a scumbag beer. It's like it's your bottom of the barrel. Look, it's on tap everywhere, but It's seen as a kind of. So I don't know what the American equivalent would be. Like I don't know, like Miller's or Budweiser or something.
Budweiser probably. Yeah, probably Budweiser. Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and we the funny thing about Budweiser, when I was in England in '97. When we'd go to pubs, they would tell us like, "Hey, didn't you know that Budweiser's an English beer?" And we're like, "No, it's not an English beer; it's American." And they would show us that it was brewed in London, and I think that's because in the UK and other parts of the world, you don't brew the beer anywhere else. You just brew it in that one brewery that makes it. Whereas like Budweiser has breweries all over the place, and so there was a brewery in London that just brewed Budweiser too. So that was kind of an interesting thing to be like, and they were drinking it. That was interesting is that the pubs in London in particular, they were drinking Budweiser.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing with beers. Like beers are just always brewed in the country that they're from. It's like sometimes I would drink when I still drank Kronenberg 1664, which on the bottle would say like France's premium lager, and then you'd look at the back of the bottle and it'd be like brewed in Newcastle, and you'd be like, cool.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of how it is. Yeah, I mean, I think probably like the same it is that like everywhere else in the world, like there's that sort of that micro brew. Well, I guess in America it was a bigger deal to have the microbrew thing because Prohibition in the 20s really like knocked out the beer industry for a large extent, and so only like the really big ones were able to survive it. And then you start to get small ones like Sam Adams in the 80s, and suddenly then in the 90s it kind of now we have so many selections for beer that it is like the Budweiser thing is still kind of like this idea of like I'm going to get a 6-pack of something, and that's what I mean. Or like when people go to American football games here in Philadelphia, they drink Bud Light on the subway on the way to the game. But there is if you're like if you're drinking just to get hammered for a game, but Budweiser is going to do the trick. But if you actually want something that tastes good, if you're only going to have a few bottles, then you get something better.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the same back in Scotland, but with tenants. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, yeah. One quick thing before we get to the movie about Tennant's Lager. My friend had in the early 2000s when we were in college. My friend had a 6-pack of Tennant's Lager from 1988, and we drank one of them. It actually, I mean, this would have been like they were like 13 years old. It wasn't horrible, but I tried to sell one on eBay. It was the very first thing I tried to sell on eBay, and nobody bought it. So yeah, nobody wanted a can of Tennant's Lager unopened from 1988. So yeah, so maybe they knew what we didn't know about its reputation in Scotland. Perfect. Well, yeah. So on to The Keeper. The Keeper comes out in 2009, which we will get into because that is an interesting year for the Seagal filmography. But the film is essentially he plays a character named Roland Salinger. So another one of those great Seagal character names. He is an LA cop, and we know he's an LA cop not because anything takes place in LA, but there are plenty of establishing shots overhead showing us that we're in LA, but we really aren't. But whatever, he's an LA cop. He has a drug bust, and his partner gets greedy when he sees the money on the table. And when Seagal says, "No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to take the money," the partner shoots him. He almost dies, but he doesn't quite die. He's in the hospital. There's a confrontation with the old partner who tries to finish him off. He kills that partner, and then, as he's recovering, the LAPD tells him, we no longer need your services. At the same time, he has an old friend who's played by a poor man's Harry Dean Stanton, who needs his help because this poor man's Harry Dean Stanton owns some property that's supposed to be in the San Antonio area. Again, we're told it's San Antonio because of the establishing shots, but it's really not. I think everything's in New Mexico in this film. But the poor man's Harry Dean Stanton has land that a criminal businessman wants to take from him, and what he wants to do is kidnap the daughter and use the daughter as a means to extort the land away from him. The daughter's played by a woman named Liesl Karstens, who was in Urban Menace. She's younger, but the poor man's Harry Dean Stanton calls Seagal, who's just recently retired, and says, "Hey, if you're not doing anything, do you want to come be a bodyguard and manage security for me so my daughter doesn't get kidnapped?" Seagal's all for it. He flies down to what is supposed to be San Antonio. And he's trying to protect the daughter. At the same time, the daughter has a boyfriend who's a boxer. We know because this guy is sort of your average late 2000s jackass kind of character that he's not going to be any good for her. And sure enough, he gets into some trouble with the bad guy businessman, and he kind of gives up the daughter. So the daughter gets kidnapped. Now the daughter's kidnapped. Seagal's got to go around and find where this daughter's being held and take down this bad guy so he can sort of save the day. I think that's pretty much it, right? I don't know if anything else happened in there that I missed, or anything at least in the synopsis standpoint.
No, not in the synopsis standpoint. That pretty much clears up what happens during the plot. I mean, obviously we'll get into the detail a little bit in a second, but yeah, no, that is the outline, and it's kind of weirdly plotted. At the start, we kind of look like we're going to get like something almost similar to the likes of Hard to Kill, where he's in the hospital, he has to recover and get revenge and stuff like that. But he gets his revenge. Basically, the Hard to Kill plot takes up the first 20 minutes of the movie, and then right. and then we get onto the Man on Fire ripoff plot for the rest of the runtime. It's kind of interestingly structured that way.
Yeah. And one of the things, so I noticed that Seagal was uncredited as a co-writer on this. And I'm wondering because, so one of the interesting things, when you look at this movie on his filmography, I would say this one here in 2009, this might be the last time that anybody in any way, shape, or form gets the drop on Seagal, which again, his partner gets the drop on him because the partner shoots him when Seagal's not expecting him to shoot him, and he gets, injured that way. I think the closest might be in End of a Gun. Jade Ewan, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen that, Jade Ewan kind of turns on him, and he kind of finds out that she was using him. But he doesn't really delve into enough about the fact that Jade Ewan was using him. That would have also meant the fact that he is kind of an overweight old man that couldn't get a woman like Jade Ewan, or the woman like Jade Ewan wouldn't be interested in at all, except to use him for his money. And he doesn't want to exactly go that far, right? He doesn't want to tell anybody that he might not be that attractive. But this, I would say, is probably the closest to that. And I think the fact that he has an uncredited writing part probably tells me that he did more to make it seem like he didn't have he wasn't duped to that degree. I think there's probably other stuff that happens in the movie as we're watching it, right? That Seagal has to be kind of omnipotent in his movies for the most part. And so the fact
Yeah.
that his character isn't fully omnipotent here tells me that the main character probably was even less so. And then that Seagal he probably mitigated more of it so he could be at least a little bit more on the omnipotent side.
Yeah, I think so. And I do think it's interesting though, because like when I was watching it, I've never seen this movie before, and I was like, oh, okay, this character seems like a very traditional Seagal character. And I've watched a few other movies from this time or know about some other movies of this time. And he seemed to be playing not kind of different characters in the sense that he's always omnipotent. He's always the biggest badass ever, and always people always tell me he's the biggest badass ever. But he did seem to be playing more kind of anti-heroes, like because in Urban Justice he seems like more of a kind of edgy kind of anti-hero type character. And then I know I've not seen it, but I know in like Pistol Whipped which was like 2008. He's like a kind of broken down. He's like a gambling addict, and he's all like this. And then in something else that I watched, which I think is also 2009, Driven to Kill. He's like a former Russian gangster turned novelist, and again, he's more of a kind of anti-hero, kind of doesn't give a fuck, whereas he seems more in the kind of traditional Seagal kind of like, not only is he the biggest badass ever, but he's like the ultimate white knight. He's like, the most gentlemanly and the most honorable and the most loyal, and like, so it seems more like a kind of 90s character he's playing here than some of the other characters he was playing around this kind of same kind of time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Pistol Whipped for me is maybe one of the best or one of my favorite of his DTV ones, especially from this 2000s period. And one interesting thing, because you're talking about sort of your progression with him, where you kind of fall off kind of in the early 2000s, and the early 2000s is where you start to get the point where he starts making multiple movies a year. And the line director for this film, Benjamin Sachs, he does a really great interview with Sean Malloy of I Must Break This podcast, and I kind of always bring this interview up because it's so insightful, and just because Benjamin Sachs kind of gives you the real deal. It was Sean had him on, of course, for his Dolph films that he produced. Yeah, but it turned into a conversation about Seagal because he's Line produced a lot of these movies, and one of the things he said is that around this period is when Seagal starts coming to him constantly, like, I need another movie, because he was low on money. He needed the cash from them, and Benjamin Sachs was like, we'll do it. We'll try to make another one for you, but you're diminishing your audience here. It's making it harder for people to keep up with your films, and they're not going to keep watching them at this stage. And 2009 is kind of a big year in the sense that I think he does 4 movies in 2009, and the only other year he did more was 2016. He had I think he had 7 movies come out in 2016, and then he kind of falls off. Like after 2016, he's only had 4 movies come out since then. So this is the start of where I think a lot of people, so you're kind of in a similar boat from a lot of people, that you start to kind of fade out and have trouble keeping up with all these Seagal movies. And the only reason why I've kept up with them, and I still, End of a Gun was one that took a long time for me to catch, but the only reason why I even caught up with them was because I had the blog site, and I was, he was in the Hall of Fame, and we were watching a lot of them. But yeah, you get that sense that the law of diminishing return starts to happen with it's starting with like movies like this one.
Yeah, I think so. But having caught up on some of them in recent years, I do think some of them are quite funny. Like, I, in the last couple of years, I've watched a number of them. Some of them I just mentioned, like Urban Justice, which is actually kind of fun. It's this kind of solid DTV effort. And Driven to Kill, which again, solid enough revenge film. A bit still, silly, but like solid enough. But some of them are like both terrible, but at the same time, just absurd as genius. So like, a couple of years ago, I finally got around to watching Out for a Kill, which is hilarious. It has a scene where he fights a guy who's doing lots of wire work in a barbershop chair, which is one of the funniest fights I have ever seen on film.
Yes.
And then just the last time, after the last time we had a conversation, we started talking about what the next movie we might do together was, and we came up with this film. I was like, I fancy watching a couple of Seagal movies. So I thought, like, I'll watch a Waxman collaboration. I watched A Dangerous Man, which was
Yes.
which had some absurdist funny elements in it, but had some kind of solid enough kind of elements as well. I say solid because, like, my kind of scale of what I would rate a DTV film is kind of different from my scale of like, I don't want to say a proper film. That sounds really snobby.
Yeah,
But like, you know what I mean? Like,
I
sometimes
do.
you'll see a DTV movie, or like a DTV action movie, that if you saw like a theatrical action movie, if it was theatrical, you might rate it 2 stars, but like, it's kind of 3 stars for a DTV one, but like 2 stars for like, a bigger one. And I'm
Yeah.
not shitting on like independent cinema, because like, I think there's a difference between indie cinema, the types of movies that are made by people who want to make them,
Yeah.
and then they maybe go on a festival film circuit, and then they maybe land on streaming. There's a difference between that and a DTV film, which is like deliberately made to be made for DVD, or to be made to land on Tubi or whatever. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like, so there's a differentiation in my mind. So like, I when I say a proper film, I include like small scale indie films as well.
Yeah.
So I really, like, yeah. I mean, some of your audience probably think, "Oh, what an elitist asshole." So like, yeah. Anyway, um, but like, back to what I was originally planning to say, which, another one that I thought was just awful, but again full of absurdist genius, was Out of Reach. I
Yes.
watched that. I did a double bill, Out of Reach and A Dangerous Man, and Out of Reach. Jesus Christ,
Yes.
that film is so insanely dumb that it just falls into the realm of, like, actually, this is kind of like unintentional brilliance. Like,
Yeah. Well, I know exactly what you mean. And it's interesting because that interview that Sean did with Benjamin Sachs, you actually kind of get a sense of where all this, the kind of the absurdist stuff comes from. And I think, to kind of to your point about, like, you don't, you say like you're I think there's a sort of understanding when it comes to DTV flicks, right? Is that, these are movies that, like, they got to spit out quickly, right? Like, there's usually a distributor involved who's like, you need to get this thing done in a couple weeks, but also, yeah, it's got, like, I think Tom Jolliffe, who's a screenwriter in England, talks about his movies where, like, a lot of his movies are filmed in England, but the distributors, in wanting them to be marketable to Americans, want all of the English actors to speak with American accents, and they want the movie to take place in America, even though it's so clearly being shot in England. And it's like, you can't blame the filmmakers for that, right? Like, but you can
no,
still
that's
kind of
true.
make
That's
fun of
true.
it and have a go at it. But you knowing that, right, it's not the filmmaker's fault that the movie's like that it's the distributor wanting it to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's absolutely fair, because that obviously there's lots of movies like that, and obviously, like, directors just get told things by studios of being like,
Right.
yeah, can you make Bulgaria look like New York? Not really, but we'll try, I guess.
Right, exactly. And I mean, that's what's happening in this movie. It's like, we know nothing takes place we know nothing was shot in Los Angeles, nothing was shot in San Antonio. And the other thing too, I think, is with Keone Waxman, and again Benjamin Sachs' line producer, and kind of the whole crew that works on a Seagal movie. They know that there's certain things that Seagal, it demands, right? Like, he never does his ADR shots. I mean, how many times do we see him, like, he's supposed to be driving a car, but that's so clearly somebody else's back who's driving that car, that it's not him.
Yeah.
Or when he was kicking somebody in one of the scenes, I think it's an early scene, just to give people, set the scene for everybody. There's a scene where he's in a limo being driven to the poor man's Harry Dean Stanton's house. And in the meantime, they see the driver's cousin is being attacked by two thugs. So Seagal goes to handle them, and in one of them, he's kicking the guy like multiple times, and it's so not Seagal kicking that guy, right? It's so definitely somebody else, and so I think that's the thing, right? You can have fun with it, and know that it's Seagal, right? That's the reason all of this stuff is so goofy, and I think, like you said. you grade DTV on a curve because of all of the things that they have to work through, and in this case, I think in a lot of cases, right, the star and having to mitigate the star's demands is another piece of it, that the movie just so needs to have this face on the tin to be able to sell streams and rentals and whatnot, that they put up with so much that. I think Benjamin Sachs talked about it, how like these stars would demand so many things, and like one of the things is like with their shooting schedules. You have this crew that would shoot maybe 16 hours a day to manage the demands of somebody like a Seagal. So yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I think we can, we can, us making fun of the movie is not like sort of like you said, like it's not shitting on DTV. It's more like you grade on a curve because that movie has different expectations involved. And so, if this was a Marvel movie that came out like this, we would definitely be killing it a lot more.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good differentiation to make, that we're grading on a different curve because of the mitigating circumstances. And even like, because like on New Horror Express, I interview a lot of low budget horror directors. And there's a lot of them who are making films sometimes on micro budgets.
Yeah.
So like, I, for example, interviewed a Brazilian director who made a really fun slasher, the kind of fun slasher stroke opera stroke other thing. Like it's a really fun film. It's called Phantom Summer. It's not really available. It's done kind of festival circuit, particularly in South America. But it's done some festivals in Europe and stuff as well, I think. He made it for like 20,000, I think roughly $20,000. I tried to do the calculation. I remember at the time I tried to do the Google calculation because it's listed in Brazilian real, the budget, right? And obviously, but even though he had mitigating circumstances in terms of like he just had like an extremely low budget, you can tell that he's got the cast he wanted from that he can get, and he's managed to kind of work within the restraints of the budget, but he's not working, but he's still making the movie he wants to make.
Yeah.
So I would even that I grade on a different curve to like this kind of DTV action, because it's like the mitigating circumstances are not just kind of budgetary. You've got all these studio restrictions, and you've got all these kind of weird things where these films are being sold in international sales on the back of a name, whether that's Dolph Lundgren or it's Bruce Willis or it's Steven Seagal or whoever it is. And then often, like you've said, they are only on their project. I mean, it's obviously here he's kind of like a main leading role, so he's on it more. But often it's like he's there, for a few days. Say the shoot is like 3 weeks long, he's there for like 3 days, and they get their 10, 15 minutes of footage out of him, and then they kind of splice it throughout the movie. So it's kind of, they're structured in a different way. They're not backed on the vision of a writer or a director or whatever. They're kind of like, oh, we just got to make the pieces fit together. And then so you give them extra latitude for that, because you're like, yeah, if this was a film that was released in theaters, or you thought was a film that didn't have these kind of studio restrictions, you'd be like, yeah, this isn't good. But you like, and like even here you still say it isn't good, but you can definitely forgive it more. And while my previous point might have sounded kind of elitist, I will go to bat for a lot of DTV films. Some people will just be like, "Oh, I would never watch DTV action," and it's all shit. It's all like a wasteland. And I'd be like, actually, no. Have you ever seen Blood and Bone? Have you ever seen Avengement? So I'm not like just somebody who's come to shit on DTV action.
Right. No. Yeah. No. I think it's a great point, because I think, and even if we do make fun of sometimes, like we always talk about, like we kind of joke with these movies with love in mind. Like we're kind of kidding with them, with love. And I think you made a great distinction the last time you were on, when we were doing the Dolph one. Kind of the difference between horror and action is that a lot of times with horror, like you said, it's somebody who's developed this project and is working on it. And yes, they have a micro budget, but it's something that they want to do. Whereas I think in a situation like The Keeper, it's a situation where Seagal comes to Benjamin Sax's people or whatever and says, we need to make the movie. Or the distributors come to him and say, okay, how much do you think you can make this movie for? And he actually said this about, just sort of in general how it works, that like he'll say, yeah, I think I can make the movie for 5 million. They say, great, make it for 3. And so then it's like, okay, that's what I've got to do. I got to make it, And then you get a director like a Keone Waxman who knows what the score is, right? He knows what it means to be working with Seagal. He knows what it means to be working on a project like this. So he's not going into it being like, boy, this is really like something that I'm artistically invested in that sense. I mean, yes, from a professional standpoint, he wants to be artistically invested as a director to like do a good job. But this isn't like Martin Scorsese saying like, boy, I really want to do, The Irishman and I want to, make this film work, and all the actors involved are thinking the same thing. It's like, okay, we need to create this Seagal vehicle. These are the pieces that we need to do to make it. Let's put all these pieces together. And then it's like, yeah, in the end it's kind of that idea is like, okay, is this something that's fun to watch? Yes or no? And sometimes it isn't fun to watch, right? Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's like, yeah, it doesn't work because like we talk about with these mitigating circumstances like Seagal, it's like, the scene where he's kicking the guy, and it's so not him kicking the guy. It's kind of almost like with The Irishman when Robert De Niro is kicking that guy, and it looks so silly because he's like older and it's not working. It's in this case, it's because Seagal's can't do the kicks and he's not going to, but they want to put them in somehow. And the movie itself is just kind of doing the best it can with that, but it's still kind of funny for us to watch and for us to joke about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think horror and action are kind of different because like I feel like when it comes to the kind of indie budgets and stuff like that, and the kind of DTV stuff, it does seem that the action, a lot of the market is based on getting a star name and getting kind of international sales. So it is kind of there. It is kind of more cynically made, whereas I do think that horror is more of a mixture. Yes, there is lots of cynically made horror. You got like, Full Moon Pictures is just a factory just pumping out movies. Right. Like there's lots of films that are like that just is like vaguely haunted house, and then they'll just slam an Amityville on the title, for no reason. There's lots of people out there who have written scripts and gone to a studio and been like, oh, the studio said this is a good script, but yeah, we're planning on making a Hellraiser sequel. Are we? I'm like, right. So there's lots of like cynical stuff in horror too, but there's more of that mix as well. It's like there's like an indie horror sphere as well, where people are who genuinely love horror going out there and making horror. And I guess like the difference is you can make horror on the lower budget, and I guess the difference is horror fans, while there is certain horror icons like Bruce Campbell or Barbara Crampton or Linnea Quigley or whoever, horror fans are more attracted to concepts than they necessarily are to stars. So you can have in a horror film, I think the way they get away with it more is you can have a complete no-name cast. But if you've got a cool hook to your movie, horror fans will be going like, oh, well, I've never seen that before. Let's check that out. Whereas I think action fans are generally more attracted to stars, or like, a name that they know, a name, at whatever level, whether that's like somebody who was one of the biggest stars in the world, like an Arnold Schwarzenegger, or even somebody who's just like a kind of, just a big deal in the DTV market, like I don't know, like a Gary Daniels or something like that, whatever. Like people will more kind of go towards like having like an actor that they know in the action genre. That seems what it's like from the way I see it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. I think I agree. I think it's definitely the case because one of the big things with the site that I noticed in terms of like, and again, it's not saying it's all about like, podcast downloads or it's all about, site views or that kind of thing. But there's definitely like a kind of a hierarchy with the names where like, Dolph Lundgren again is one who really moves the needle. Bruce Willis is one, and I think Bruce Willis is an interesting one because I was in this mindset of like I'm not going to really do any more Bruce Willis because he's even we found out of course that he had health concerns, and that's why he was so scant in his films. But it was like you watch a movie where you watch the trailer and think like, okay, Bruce Willis is starring in this movie, and then you watch it and he's out of it for huge chunks of time, and it's like, why am I watching this for these other people in the movie? Like this movie's not doing anything. And usually in those cases, the plots were really difficult and there were a lot of other things that were going on with them. But then, I kind of found this resurgence with these Bruce Willis movies because I did a solo podcast episode where I just talked about a few episodes, and then Ty from Comeuppance was like, hey, I'd actually like to be on your podcast, because usually him and his brother together will come on and we would do like these list episodes. He's like, I kind of like that format. I'd like to come on and do some of those movies with you. And we've been doing them. And again, it's that idea. And I think you're right that like, there's almost like a siren song with these names for action fans. And you see that name and you're like, oh, I got to check that out. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody. And I think with horror, you're absolutely correct, where almost a lot of times horror is the horror genre actually builds the name as opposed to the other way around. Like actors who were in a movie that ends up taking off, they become famous enough that they can be in other films. One name, I think it was Danielle Harris, who was in the Halloween movies, is now has parts in all kinds of low budget horror films because people just recognize her and see her and that kind of thing. But you're right, like horror films, like you said, if the concept's good and the word of mouth is there too. That's the other thing too with horror is I think of movies like Avengement, maybe, or like you said, like Blood and Bone, but they don't quite have the kind of word of mouth ecosystem that horror films do.
No, but I think that's also to do with the fact that like horror is kind of on its own when it comes to like having its own ecosystem. I can't think of any other genre that has its own ecosystem in the same way. So like action films don't have the same film festivals that horror does.
Right.
There's lots of horror film festivals all over the world. I knew about a bunch of them before I started the podcast 5 years ago. I now know about a lot more of them. So like it has its own ecosystem. And even like there's a lot of horror fans who won't read like mainstream reviews. They just read horror sites, like the big horror sites like Rue Morgue and Fangoria and Bloody Disgusting and Dread Central and these kind of things. And then Joe Blow has one that's called Arrow in the Head. So like it even has like its own review ecosystem as well. So like it has an entire infrastructure that is kind of separate from the rest of movies. So like yeah, and action just doesn't have that. And I mean, it'd be cool if action had that too. And like action had the bigger side. I'd love if the likes of Blood and Bone and likes of Avengement like got bigger word of mouth, and because I will go to bat for them just like my kind of indie horror favorites too. So yeah, but it just doesn't seem work out like that.
Yeah, well, and I think talking about Blood and Bone, the great point you make too out of Blood and Bone, like I think of Michael J. White is a great example too of like the difference between the horror ecosystem and the action ecosystem is that a Michael J. White has the talent to be bigger, right? He should be a bigger name and be doing bigger things. I mean, if we'd put Michael J. White in this movie, The Keeper, it would have probably been a really electric action thriller, as opposed to this kind of goofy Seagal thing that we're kind of lampooning. But the mindset is, well, there's no way the international market's going to go for Michael J. White the way they go for Seagal. But I mean, you think Blood and Bone's one example. Black Dynamite's another great one he did. So he's got these really great films. But you're right, like the word of mouth on those is not the way like the horror, if he did a horror, like, if he was a horror star, like a Danielle Harris, that's just the name that comes to mind. But even like a Tony Todd from Candyman, like horror, he can just get into horror movies. He can also do the horror festival circuit in a way that someone like a Michael J. White can't. I think, like Dolph does sci-fi circuits, which are kind of not quite to the same size as horror, but still kind of a big, that's a big arc. Or they can do comic book ones now, right? Like now that Dolph Lundgren's done, he did Punisher, and I guess Michael J. White could do comic book ones because he was in Spawn. So yeah, I think that's it's an interesting thing with that with those guys. Like like how that ecosystem works and that kind of thing. But yeah, so we're gonna take a quick break here. So we'll stop here, but then we'll come back and we'll kind of finish up talking on The Keeper. All right, see you in a second, everyone.
Hey everyone, we'll get back to the podcast in a second, but first I have a new novel out, Holtman Arms. It follows Colvin Hall, an aspiring writer who decides to write a romance novel on a whim, sends it to a publisher, and it becomes a huge success. The only problem is, no one knows it's him because he writes under the pen name Mary Ballantyne. With all of the money and none of the fame, Colvin longs for the world to recognize his accomplishments. When he gets an opportunity to write a freelance article on a washed-up 90s pop star looking for a comeback, that recognition starts to come, but is it all he hoped for? It doesn't matter because he's getting it whether he likes it or not. Holtman Arms is the second in my author's cycle after A Girl and a Gun, and like that previous novel, it explores themes of success and accomplishment in the 21st century. You can buy it now through Amazon in paperback or on Kindle. The link is in the podcast description. As always, thanks for your support.
All right, we are back, and yeah, kind of getting back into The Keeper. One of the interesting things about this that I was going to mention is we have a poor man's Harry Dean Stanton who plays. I don't know if you thought of him that way. Maybe I'm just the one thinking that he was kind of Harry Dean Stanton-esque.
I guess now you mention it, I guess he is kind of Harry Dean Stanton esque guy. Yeah, I don't know if I've seen him in anything. I know the actor's name is Steph Duvall, and not sure if I've seen them in other things, but yes, I can see it now. I can see that Harry Dean Stanton didn't come to mind, but I can see it now. Of course, Seagal starred opposite Harry Dean Stanton in Fire Down Below.
Right, exactly. That's a good point. And so yeah, so he's worked with him before. Yeah, it was like the character. It's because Roger Ebert had what he called the Stanton Walsh rule, right? That any movie that had either Harry Dean Stanton or M. Walsh had to be good. And I guess he said that the exception to that rule ended up being Dream a Little Dream with Harry Dean Stanton, which I don't know. I kind of wonder if he ever.
I presume he wasn't a fan of Fire Down Below either, to be honest.
Exactly. Well, I wonder if he was alive long enough, what he would have thought of Scorpion King 4 with M. Walsh in it. So he probably wouldn't have been a fan of that. But I think with this movie, I think the rule, the Ebert rule, that whenever you have a poor man's Harry Dean Stanton, the movie's probably not going to work. And this movie, like you said, it's I think for like it's a 90-minute actioner. It does have its lull moments. I think that's the one thing, is that it's for 90 minutes, I think there's just so many moving parts going on with it, and so many things with like the daughter and all of that we don't get as much action as we'd like. But I think the runtime maybe mitigates that a bit. But I don't know, kind of how were you feeling about it? Was it boring, or did it work, or that kind of thing?
Don't think it was boring. I think there is kind of too many moving parts. I think that I did think it was going to be a bit of a slog to start with. So like basically in that opening 20 minutes, because that opening 20 minutes is we get that drug bust, we get him recovering in hospital. We get him kind of, we get like a kind of montage of him like getting fit again and stuff like that, and that's kind of the opening 20 minutes. It's pretty slow, and there is some stupid stuff in it. Basically the first shot of the movie we see after the credits, where we get lots of whooshy establishing shots of LA, is like this kind of overhead shot of like this car, and we get like this ADR dialogue of like him and his partner talking in his car, and it doesn't quite sound like Steven Seagal, even though you know that it's supposed to be Seagal's character. So you're like, okay, that's weird. And then like the drug bust is the action of the drug bust is kind of filmed in that awful kind of mid to late 2000s hyper caffeinated editing style, where you're like, I guess I saw an action sequence. So like at that point I was like, oh man, I don't know, this might be a slog. Although there is a funny part to that drug bust, because like, as we know, I don't think we've discussed this yet, but one of Seagal's many ridiculous things is his, his kind of cultural appropriation. So
Yes.
whenever he's talking to a Hispanic person, he puts on like a fake Mexican accent. Whenever he's talking to a black person, he's kind of talking kind of Ebonics. Like he always bows to Asian people, even like whatever. Like it's a weird tick that he has, and like when his partner like draws a gun on him, and then he goes full gangster and goes, "Motherfucker, I thought I knew you." I was
Right.
I was like, that was the first laugh of the film. I was like, all right, okay, maybe this is going to be quite fun after all. Like, let's see. And then again, we get this thing, slow recovery, and like when he's in the hospital, we get like the same shot of him like lying, pretending to be asleep, looped like 3 times. We get the same shot like 3 times, and I was like, Jesus Christ. But then again, and then he shoots the partner. I was like, that's fine, all right, okay. It's quite boring. But then we get like a classic Seagal moment when he's recovering, and that part of the film's like quite slow and boring. But we get, I think it's his niece. So his niece comes to visit, and like, and he's complaining about his recovery. And the thing I love about this is his niece says to him, like, "Oh man, you shouldn't worry about your recovery. Most people would have died of what you went through." And then I've literally written down the quote that you are the inspiration for every guy who ever applied for the SWAT team, presumably in history. And I was like, oh, that's... And the great thing about Seagal is, like, clearly, this is the kind of thing Seagal tries to get in the script, but his character reacts in a kind of full, humble way of kind of like, you shouldn't.
Exactly. Well, and this was for me, I think, I think that there's the uncredited Seagal write-ins in this, and I think those were there. But also, it's the huge mitigation of the fact that somebody got the drop on him, right? It's like, hey, his partner got the drop on him, but he's essentially Superman because he survived this shooting that nobody else would have survived. And like you said, the result is because he's considered Superman because he's superhuman in the way he survived this, that he's an inspiration. He gets to be this inspiration to all the other SWAT cops. That like, this idea that like there's like a Seagal picture that everybody's like everybody wants to be Seagal, but it's that mitigation factor because, again, in his movies, essentially after this, nobody gets the drop on Seagal, right? If this movie had been made 5 years after this, his partner would have tried to shoot him and he would have shot the partner first, like kind of like, Old West gun drawing style. And then he would have come up with some kind of fugazi thing about like red tape that probably would have gotten him kicked off the force. Like, oh, you shot your own partner, man, it was a bum deal. I never did anything like that. The motherfucker tried to shoot me first and I had to get him first, and then he goes down to, so like, the fact that even somebody got the drop on him is, I think, I wonder if he kind of came out of this movie like watching it after me, like, I don't like the fact that guy shot me. I'm Seagal. Nobody's supposed to shoot me first. But yeah, the mitigation was so extreme that he had to become an inspiration for everybody.
Yeah. So that's kind of like, I was like, that was my kind of like second laugh of the movie. Right. And I was like, okay, it's been relatively boring so far, but I've got 2 laughs so far, so I'm all right. I'm on track. So like, and then later on, I guess like, later on, some of the action is good. And like there is some fun absurdist moments. So when the main villain obviously sends out some of his goons to attempt to kidnap Nikita, which is the character who later does get kidnapped. But the first kidnapping attempt fails. The way the first kidnapping attempt fails is hilarious. So basically, Mason, her boyfriend and douchebag, he's apparently a famous boxer. So when they come out of a club, they get stalked by paparazzi, and there's all these paparazzis outside their car, because she's the daughter of like this kind of former cop stroke turned oil millionaire, and he's the famous boxer. And then he gets out the car to confront the paparazzi. the paparazzi then reveal themselves to be gangsters who are kidnappers.
Yeah.
And which I found funny because I was like, yeah, but what if he didn't get out of the limo? Like,
right.
Like, was that always part of the plan? Because, like, Mason later is a turncoat and later becomes part of the gangster. But at this point in the movie, it seems he has not become part of the kind of criminal underworld. So, yeah, I don't know. Like, would they have just like? I mean, would they just at what point would they reveal themselves to be kidnappers if Mason hadn't got out of the car? And why go through the whole like they're on their own. They've got like one bodyguard. It's basically her, Mason, the bodyguard, and the driver. So there's like 4 of them in a completely empty car park. Why go through the elaborate charade of being pretend paparazzi?
Right. Well, and right, because we know that Mason hasn't gone turncoat yet because there's this whole scene in a cafe, in an outdoor cafe that Seagal witnesses where he sees him go turncoat. So he hadn't gone turncoat yet at that point. He was still, I mean, he wasn't loyal to her because he was cheating on her with other women, but he at least wasn't a part of the kidnapping. And so, yeah, and then the other thing too, these kidnappers do such a great job because they just drive away in the limo without realizing that she could just open the door if she wanted to. And of course, driving out of a car park like that, it's not like you can go that fast to get out of there, though. Anybody who's been in there with, you see people that drive pretty fast in those, and you've got to be careful. But she just gets out and runs away. They kind of create some like manner of intrigue too that didn't make any sense, where she tries to get out one way, it's locked, so she just comes back the way she came and then just like jumps down like a ledge area and runs off. And it was the kidnappers were not great. It's funny how I guess it's like maybe they learn and they get to be better kidnappers later, or maybe the baddie hires a better kidnapper later when they do it. But it was quite a scene. And then of course, we go through this whole thing of Seagal coming down there and like revamping all their security, which again did absolutely nothing because she ended up getting kidnapped anyway.
Yeah, that's right. Because like they let her still date Mason, who's clearly a terrible person. Like, because we're introduced, like basically, we're introduced to Mason as he's doing some sparring in a boxing gym.
Yeah,
and he just completely beats up a guy in sparring, which seems like. It seems like it's just a poorly run boxing gym if you can just knock people out. Like you're really not supposed to do that in sparring. Like if you've been in any boxing gym or any MMA gym or any martial art arena, just like knocking people out in training, it's generally seen as a little bit of a faux pas.
Right.
So anyway, and then he's just like hanging out, sleazing on other women in the club in front of his girlfriend, and then seems weirdly surprised that his girlfriend calls him out on it. Right. And his priorities are so fucking weird.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned that scene in the cafe that happens much later on in the movie. Mason goes to meet up some of the bad guys, Jason Cross's goons, to basically say that I know Mr. Cross gave me this money to take a dive in a fight. I'm not willing to do that, but apparently I am willing to sell out my girlfriend. So for some reason, I care more about my boxing record than the person that I am allegedly in love with, which is, wow. I mean,
right. Yeah, and the other thing too, of course, that's happening for us as the viewer that makes this even kind of smarmier is that Seagal shows up, and we don't have an age for Liesl Karstens, the actress who plays Nikita. But my hunch is, if I were to guess, she wasn't born any earlier than probably the mid '80s, but could be even potentially younger than that. And her character.
Yeah, that was my guess too. Like I was born in 1985, and I would have guessed her age is like similar to mine, or even maybe a couple of years younger than I am.
Yeah, I mean, at least the character she's playing is someone who's going out to nightclubs in her early 20s. So at the very least, that's who she's playing. and she starts developing feelings for Seagal's character. And they don't take it fully all the way there, right? Like there is no love sequence between them or anything like that. And the funny thing is that the poor man's Harry Dean Stanton, he seems completely fine with all of it. He's fine with her dating this cheeseball guy, and he's like, the boxer. He's like, oh, he's a young guy. Young guys do things like I don't know. I mean, we've both been there. We've both been young guys at one time. I don't remember. I don't know about you, but I was never in a situation where I was like, oh, I'm dating somebody, but I'm going to go to a club and think it's okay to hang out with multiple other women and possibly, and hook up with them. That wasn't really something that I saw as an okay thing.
No,
but I guess
I didn't think that was an okay thing either. But then, like, I guess he did say that that's when a young guy. Like it's a very dim view of masculinity.
Right.
Oh, it's just like because he specifically says, and neither of us were rich and famous when we were young.
Right.
So like he specifically says, oh yeah, if you become famous and rich as a young male, of course you will be an actively sexual predator. So it's just like, wow. I mean, I hope not all famous young guys are sexual predators.
Right. Yeah, so we get that, and he seems to be completely fine with that, as opposed to being like, yeah, my daughter maybe shouldn't be with this guy. And then she seems to be okay with her having feelings for Steven Seagal's character, who is, at least a good 30 years her senior. And to be honest, yes, his character is cool in the sense that he can fight people, but beyond that, I don't know really what he's bringing to the table. Like he's not bringing a lot of personality to the table. Obviously, he's carrying around a spare tire, and I'm not here to make fun of anybody's weight, but I'm just saying, like, if the charisma is not happening, right there, beyond the fact that he can fight people, and maybe that's enough for her, maybe that's plenty fine for her, but it did take on an odd kind of, like we were talking about with Command Performance, right? Whereas like every woman had a thing for Dolph's character. At least Dolph's character has that like that Scandinavian good looks kind of chiseled features thing that I mean, I guess it's Seagal's favor here. Yes, the hair is interesting, but at least he doesn't have that like that Chia Pet like donut goatee thing that he seems to sport in a lot of later movies. So I guess it's not so bad. And again, the movie doesn't fully take it there.
No, it doesn't fully take it there, and maybe it's just like because it does seem like quite a grim world in this movie. There's a scene earlier on in the movie where two of Jason Cross's goons hassle a Mexican woman called Allegra, and they're quite basically she spits at one of them, and then he makes a quite sexually aggressive comment. And then kind of tries to throttle her, and then thankfully Seagal steps in and like just beats him up and then breaks his friend's arm and stuff like that. And then later on in the movie, there is a scene in the club, apparently the one club in town. Like seems like a big city, but apparently they just have one club. But anyway, but we'll skip over that. Basically one of Mason's friends tries to undo a woman's dress at the bar despite her showing no sexual interest in him whatsoever. So and there's lots of these little moments where it seems like 90% of the males in this movie are potential rapists. So the fact that Seagal's character has no rapey vibe, which is unusual in this film. Maybe that's just enough. That's just enough to get he's one of the few non-rapey guys.
That's a really great point, because you're right with that grim view kind of thing. Because when you look at a lot of his direct-to-video movies, it's the same thing, right? It's in this case, it's a woman who is playing the daughter of a close friend. But a lot of times, when he's in Eastern Europe, right, these are Eastern European women. They're usually like Eastern European models that are just in the film. But in a lot of cases, there's situations where they're coming from trafficking situations where he's rescuing them. There's a lot of knight in shining armor kind of movies with him. There's there, I think the one that I just watched recently, End of a Gun, he's protecting this woman, played by Jade Ewan, who was in pop group the Sugar Babes. And in her case, actually, she's a little bit different because she actually has a little bit more agency. She's extremely good looking, and there's a sense that she's using her good looks to manipulate Seagal, which of course he doesn't want to fully go there, but there is that vibe there. But yeah, I think of a lot of them. I think one of them that's really bad in that sense, because A Dangerous Man is there, and then I think it's A Good Man, which I guess that's not the same character. It's the same character as in Force of Execution, but not. It's another Keone Waxman one. But in A Good Man, he befriends a young woman who has what we think is a young daughter. But we find out that no, it's the young sister, and it's almost like this sense of like, oh, good, she's not defiled, right? By she's chased for Seagal to be able to save her. And in her situation, she's being forced to tend bar for a local Russian mafia, as opposed to being a human trafficked white slavery victim. But yeah, there's a lot of those kind of vibes in there in terms of the way his interactions are with women, that I think you could definitely talk about that. Like, there's that sense that, like, in a way, it's almost like we think of when you talk about the issues that he's had. It's almost kind of like Bill Cosby sort of grooming the audience, right? That like, oh no, Seagal can't be doing any of these things that he's been accused of, because look at him in these movies. He's the one guy that's not the rapey guy.
Yeah, he's always beating down these creeps, and like I have to say, right, when he does the couple of scenes that we get some martial arts action, which is very slight,
right.
But we get a smattering of it, are actually relatively relatively solid.
Yeah.
Like, they're very brief, but his little beatdown of the two kind of goons who harass Allegra was pretty good, and his beatdown of like Mason's like friend who like tries to sexually harass that girl in the club, that's like decent. And then he has one later on in a cafe, which is quite fun. And then he has the final fight with like Jason Cross's second in command, which again is quite fun. So like, I think like these are the kind of, even though we get like long stretches of it, like not much happening and it being a bit boring, and like there is a bunch of padding here, obviously when he's trying to get back to fitness from recovery, we get this like knife throwing montage which seems to go on for a long time. And when he first comes to the kind of mansion compound, he's like, yeah, we got to do security my way, and then we get like a kind of like fitting the home security montage, which again seems to go on for quite a long time. So
right.
there's a bunch of padding here, but there's enough. There's just enough to keep your interest. Like just as you're about to kind of switch off and be like, yeah, I don't know, oh, what? There's just enough that you're like, oh, okay, I'll give you, like, oh, Seagal will break another person's arm, or we'll get like and again, like another absurd Seagal moment where, some character tells him how brilliant he is, and then he just kind of sits back and goes, oh yeah, no, that's okay, like, yeah, I'm just, like, even like when he breaks that guy's arm in the club, like he beats up Mason's friend, and then Nikita is like all over him, like, I've never seen anything like that. That was the greatest thing I've ever saw, kind of thing. And he's like, I just got lucky, like, and like, and it's kind of all hilariously done. And I did notice, like, because I had like the sound like maxed out on this film, because like, even though Seagal tends to mumble his dialogue, it seemed extra mumbly in this movie, I have to say.
Yeah, exactly. And you get those ADR moments where it's so not him talking, which is, just like you get those moments where that's definitely not him in the reverse shot, or that's not him kicking somebody. The doubling work that you get with these is a lot. But you're right. There's a lot of these moments where it's like how great Seagal is, like where like there's that scene where Liesl, or where Nikita's talking to her dad, the poor man's Harry Dean Stanton, and she's saying how she wanted Seagal to beat up Mason, that she thought it would be good for him. And he's just kind of smirking because he's overhearing it, like, oh yeah, she she kind of digs it, that kind of thing. So it is all kind of really interesting. But like, you're right. I think one of the things that helps this movie, and people think I'm obsessed with runtimes with movies, because my rule is I always say, like, I like the Roger Corman rule of 88 minutes, because it's 11 reels and you don't go over that, as opposed to 90 minutes. 80 minutes is even better for me. But yeah, anything that once you get after 90 minutes, I always feel like it's borrowed time. And this movie, it clocks in, I think, at like 94. So it's really not horrible. I mean, that extra 4 minutes is probably coming in at the credits mostly. And I think when you get a movie when it's stuck in that 90-minute range, yes, there's padding, but you can only do padding so much before you've got to get to those action sequences. And I think that does help a little bit, that this isn't going to be a long sit for you, that 90 minutes will get you there. So in that sense, it's kind of a fun Seagal actioner in that way.
Yeah, there's kind of like quite a few people die in this movie. Like, yes. you do get quite, and it's quite funny, because when the kidnapping, the second kidnapping, the one that actually does work, right, there's like a massive shootout. Like Seagal, he comes across, because basically he's given Nikita this necklace that has this transponder, so he can always follow her, so he knows his whereabouts, so he could be a bodyguard 24/7 or whatever. So he follows in the car, because he apparently cannot get back to Nikita faster than Mason can, to warn her that Mason is in on the kind of kidnap plot. But anyway, we'll skip over that. So, basically, Mason sets her up, and then she is kidnapped. And, Seagal has this massive shootout, followed by a car chase, and then is subsequently arrested. Because he's killed like 4 people or whatever. Right. And he's not an law enforcement officer, or he's, obviously he's a former, he's just been mandatory retired from LAPD, but this is apparently set in Texas. So he's had this shootout, and then they're like thinking about arresting him, but then in the end he just kind of gets a stern telling off of so we kind of get that kind of scene that you typically get in like a kind of Lethal Weapon type movie, where the captain tells off our hero and being like, right, yeah, you do that again and you'll be off the force, or you're suspended, give me your badge. Right. We kind of get that from this kind of Detective Simon character, but then apparently, because like you say, off-brand Harry Dean Stanton has a lot of strings that he can pull. He phones up and be like, can you not take a light on him? And also because of Seagal's natural amazing charm, the detective just shares ongoing investigation information with him, and then he's let go. With just a slap on the wrist of and don't go about killing people again. Okay. So you do get that, and that's that. I mean, again, it's kind of short. The editing's a bit janky, and it's like that kind of late 2000s editing that it's kind of makes your head spin a little. Although I do think the worst example of that is in the opening drug bust scene. I do think that the editing actually calms down a little as we kind of drift on into the later parts of the movie. So yeah, there's just enough. There's just enough. Every so often, just when you're getting bored, you're just being like, oh man, feels like we're hanging around this mansion a lot, just watching Seagal just kind of walking around, but then something will happen and you'll be like, oh, that was kind of fun. Okay, I'll continue.
And I think that's kind of the thing with these Seagal movies, right? When people see these on their streaming sites or whatever. Now, this one isn't as available for streaming. So I know, in my case, actually, I got lucky because we were talking about this last night. Or last night my time, and I discovered my cable company had a deal where I could rent it but not pay. So it was essentially a free, I had a free rental is what they gave me. So I had seen it before when I reviewed it, but of course I wanted to watch it again because it had been a long time. But this is the kind of movie it's probably not worth anything to like go out of your way to find it. But like if you're browsing one of your streaming, services that you're subscribed to and you see it on there and you're looking for like a 90-minute time killer, it kind of does the trick in that sense, which I think that's probably what the goal is of these movies when they've got Seagal on the tin, is that like whether you're at that time in 2009, you would have been browsing the video store still for DVDs, but still that idea that like, yeah, I could do a lot worse than this tonight. And that's how it kind of makes its money.
Yeah. I think what would have made this I think what would have made this movie even better is like if it had like a stronger villain.
Yeah.
Because like, and I don't know if this is the actor's fault. The basically the villain Jason Cross really isn't in the movie that much. I don't think the first sight we see of him is in the club, and I think that is like 35 to 40 minutes into the movie. I don't know exactly. I didn't timestamp it or anything. But yeah, and then we just kind of see him kind of sporadically throughout. And I think what was great, particularly about like the kind of 90s Seagal films, is often to kind of compensate for the fact that like Seagal underacts to the point of barely being there. They would get like a really good actor as a villain to like overact. So like, and obviously you've got like Michael Caine and On Deadly Ground. You've got Tommy Lee Jones in Under Siege. You've even got somebody like Chris Christopherson in Fire Down Below, and they're just chewing scenery like there's nobody's business, Right. And I think like, and so it ends up kind of balancing out. And I think that as fun as moments of this movie was, I think there could have been more fun there if they got like just an actor who was willing to commit to just being like just one of the kind of over the top performances that like you see in a lot of these kind of Seagal movies.
Yeah. Well, and another technique that they would use in Seagal movies that this I think could have also helped this movie is a lot of times there's a younger actor who does the heavy lifting. And I guess in 2009, maybe we're not quite at that point yet with his career. Actually, now that I think about it, we hadn't quite gotten there yet for him. It's something that comes later on for him that you start to see, actors like Byron Mann in Absolution, or Bren Foster in I believe it's a Force of Execution. In A Good Man, the actor's name Victor, I can never remember his last name. Victor Webster, who was doing the Scorpion King sequels. They go in and do all the really exciting scenes, and that's another thing I think that could have helped this too, is that part of the reason I think why we had so few fight scenes, and the ones that we had, they were good, but a lot of times they were also kind of in that more what I would call the slap chop variety, where it's just Seagal doing his slap chop routine, and then the guy just gets knocked out, or he gets them in a hold or something like that. Whereas like when you get like,
because I think at this point he just wasn't willing to move his lower body, so we just get like a shot of like his arms. And yeah, he just does a kind of quick Aikido move. So like it doesn't look as cool as like some of his best fights, but like, I mean, they're kind of still effective enough. But yeah, like you say, I don't think because I haven't really seen any of those movies, and I think most of the movies from this period that I have seen, like this one and Urban Justice and like Driven to Kill, like it's all pretty much on his shoulders. He doesn't have like a kind of like a partner or anything. I guess he does in A Dangerous Man, but like he's like his partner's not great in that.
yeah. No, I think you're right. Like he, it's not quite this. It's like it's just sort of starting, right? The idea is just sort of starting that he's going to do that. Byron Mann, I think. Does Byron Mann play the bad guy in that one? I can't remember. In A Dangerous Man, I think he may have been the baddie in it, and that was I remember
I think the kind of like, and he's a bit useless. The kind of younger guy kind of going along with that. If I remember right, I think that's Jesse Hutch.
Yes, I think you're right.
Is the guy who's like kind of it's kind of like his sidekick, if you want to say, in that movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this one, I think it had Byron Mann as the bad guy who was great, but except the fight scene at the end wasn't good. Like the fight scene, because again, Seagal's omnipotent, so he doesn't, he can't take any hits from Byron Mann. So they kind of mitigate it better in Absolution, where Byron Mann is out there really getting after it. We get to see all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, I think I think a Dangerous Man might have been a little bit, or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, Dangerous Man might have been a little bit better than this one in terms of that. And I also kind of, I think for those '09 ones, I kind of like the oh, why can't I think of the name of it? The Russian one.
Driven to Kill.
Driven to Kill, yeah, where he plays a Russian. I think those two are a little bit better than this one, but then the fourth one that comes up.
I would say that those two are a tad better than this one, and I would say probably the best of the '09 ones I've seen. I've not seen Against the Dark. I don't really have plans to. So I think Driven to Kill is possibly the best one, just because it's like the most. It's very, I know it's kind of before. It's like 5 years before John Wick came out, but like, I guess it's kind of very much in that Taken kind of manner. And while I actually don't like the Taken films, because like, Driven to Kill has like that typical kind of Seagalist absurdity. I wouldn't say necessarily it's a good film, but like I would say that actually I had more fun watching Driven to Kill than Taken, even though Taken is technically a better made movie, just because of like the kind of grim tone of those movies and that kind of faux seriousness of like all the characters apart from the lead character, kind of like stereotypically dumb action movie characters, but we're supposed to take it super serious, and you're like, I don't know, I don't get this. So I would say that's the best one, because it's just very streamlined, and you get quite a lot of action in that movie, and it's hilarious that Seagal is a former Russian mafia member turned novelist.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, that one all worked out. Now, Against the Dark. So actually, we were talking about Sean Malloy earlier when he talked to, I was talking about his interview with Benjamin Sachs, but he actually kind of like following a similar path with you, where he did a Dolph film the first time he was on, and then we did a Seagal film for his second time. He picked Against the Dark as the one he wanted to do, and so it's like a vampire movie that has Seagal in it, and the way he described it is like kind of the best way if you're ever thinking about seeing it. He described it as, let's say you're a catering company and you've gotten this really great catering job. And so you're excited to do this catering job, and then somebody comes and tells you, okay, yeah, you're still going to have this catering job, but now every single dish that you make, you need to somehow incorporate pineapple into it. And that's kind of what this movie was, where it's like, it's this vampire movie. It's kind of your classic vampire movie in the sense of like a group of people in sort of like the apocalypse kind of vampire deal, where like there's a virus or something, and a group of people are trying to escape the area they're in to get to another safe place. And it has that feel, and they've just essentially grafted Seagal onto the film, and so that's sort of how that one feels. So, out of these '09 ones, it's probably the least impressive out of those.
Yes, I kind of picked that up. I was like, as much as I've enjoyed, and I do enjoy like these Seagal films for their absurdity, and sometimes there's ones like Under Siege and Out for Justice and stuff like that I actually think are legitimately great, and I will kind of stick up for, even though yes, Seagal can't act, but like I think they're just well-made movies. I think they're cool. Having read the Seagalology book, I have to say, when I was reading about Against the Dark, I was like, I think I might put this in the kind of, bucket with, things like Flight of Fury and Submerged and things like that. That I'm just like, I think I might take a swerve, because there's even like way more dedicated Seagal fans than I am, who are like, yeah, Submerged, Against the Dark, ugh. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah. You will stick up, people that will stick up for a lot of DTV crap that like Seagal has put out will not stick up for these films. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I won't watch them. But then, I mean, I've watched a lot of terrible horror films. I've watched probably some of the worst horror films ever made. So who knows?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I could say so. I kind of, once I started this site, it was like, okay, I've got to kind of watch them all. So I haven't watched Clementine, which is one that Seagal did. It was a Korean production, and it's in Korean, and I think there are English language versions of it you can find out there, but it doesn't quite fit the direct to video mode necessarily as a lot of the other ones. But I just recently finally saw the last direct to video one I had to see, which was End of a Gun. And the reason why it took so long is I was waiting for it to be free on streaming because I just didn't want to pay for it. And so finally showed up on Redbox, the service here. They actually had a free version, so I watched it. So I now can say I've actually seen all of the direct to video ones. Again, depending on whether somebody counts Clementine or not. And I got to say, when you hit this period of 2009, right, when you're talking about The Keeper, Dangerous Man, Driven to Kill in particular, he starts to fall off after that. And there is one exception, and that is a movie called Attrition that he made in 2018 that was a production that I think he was really invested in. Like, it was something that he really wanted to make, and he put a lot into, which explains why it's so good. In 2016, he has, I think, 7 movies come out in 2017. It's kind of like this last gasp thing where he just puts out a bunch of stuff. And then after that, he's only had a few. I think he's had 4 come out since then. But that's kind of the last gasp. But so this is an interesting period, this 2009 period, because I mean, you can find things to like in those other ones, but you don't get as many keepers like you would, like you'd want. And keepers, I think, are the kind of movies where, like we've described, where they get the job done. They're not spectacular. You can find plenty that are better, but they get the job done for a time killer. He gets to a point where you start to get fewer and fewer that work as a time killer.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing. And I don't think I've watched any of his movies kind of post kind of this period. I think presumably was Machete 2010.
Yes,
is the appearance in that. So I think that's the latest I've got. And I think the reason for that is like the Seagal movies I enjoy are kind of like this movie or Driven to Kill or A Dangerous Man or Urban Justice, that are like solidly made DTV movies that are a bit absurd, and they're good time killers. Or the ones that are just bonkers. So like Out for a Kill, Out of Reach, Into the Sun, the ones that are just like insane, and you're just like, how the fuck did this get made? Right. Like, and they so they have a lot of enjoyment as well. They might be terrible films, but like it's just like they're just like they've got so much kind of nuttiness in them. You're like you just like can't help but watch. You're like, wow, what'll happen next? He's finding a guy in a barbershop chair, not giving a fuck, and this guy's like swinging about like a monkey, like like all that kind of stuff. So like that's the kind of 2 modes, and like I think from what I've seen from trailers of a lot of his kind of like post 2010 stuff, they just look kind of boring. They don't look like fun time killers like Driven to Kill or an Urban Justice, and they don't look like totally nuts like an Out of Reach or an Out for a Kill. So I don't know, like maybe someday I will check some of them out. I did want to mention like like if just kind of a last thing on this movie before we like wrap up or whatever, is I did enjoy like his end fight with the main henchman of Jason Cross, the Tori, because like when he's kind of chasing Tori, we get like a fun moment where Tori shoots a bunch of barrels which just explode. I mean, presumably they were full of oil, I guess. Right. But even then, I don't know if they would cause that explosion from one bullet to one barrel. But anyway, it's cool. You get the stereotypical like action star walking away from the explosion in a cool manner. So you get that. Now you get that fun pop. And then they go into the final fight. Initially, Tori just is like, all right, I give up. But then he's like, oh, fuck it, I'll fight you. And then he says, mi casa, tu casa, motherfucker, which I don't think makes sense as like a kind of bring it online. My house is your house, motherfucker. Like as an insult, I don't think that works. But anyway, it's such an absurd line. I had to write it down and be like, yep, that's fun. And then we get a classic Seagal moment where, the guy obviously owns a glass table and Tori is thrown through that glass table.
Yeah.
And then he finishes him off with a killer throat punch, which seems excessive, but like it's Seagal. He's always going to go for the overkill. So yeah, I thought that. Oh yeah, and then after he gets a thank you from everybody, oh thanks for saving the day. We get like a slow mo walking away from the crime scene as the fire still sizzles, and I'm like, yeah, classic. So yeah, so like that kind of end sequence, I was like, it was, there's a lot of kind of low moments in this movie, but there is these moments that are worth it, and that kind of end sequence was one of them.
Yeah, I agree, because usually with Seagal with those end fights, it's not as much fun because he dispatches of the baddie completely without them laying a finger on him, and that was the case here, right? This guy is no match for Seagal, and he can't fight him at all. Like it's pretty quick and done over, done quick. I shouldn't say it's done quickly, because it's like the guy gets beaten up and then he comes back for more, gets beaten up more. But you're right. Like it hits all of those points, like the smashing through the thing. The guy picks up a broken bottle, like he's going to use that to fight Seagal, and it's like you got to have weapons, right? Because I think that's part of Seagal's deal is he needs to be able to disarm people with weapons. So he's got to be able to do his slap chop thing to knock things out of people's hands. The throat thing. It was like I think he actually used his fingers to like impale the throat, almost like not quite to the extent of the Patrick Swayze throat rip of
not quite to that, because there's no gore or anything. It's just like he just like basically crushes his larynx and kills them.
Exactly. And it is kind of satisfying. I mean, when I think of the best ones with Seagal with those end fights, I mean my favorites, my two favorites for these DTVs, I think we were talking about Out for a Kill, and
yes.
You're talking about the absurdity in that movie. The most absurd thing for that movie is the very end where the baddie is running away and Seagal grabs a samurai sword off the counter or whatever, off the shelf, and opens up the window. He's on the second floor and just hurls this samurai sword from the second story window at the guy who's escaping into his car and decapitates him. With that, which was just absolutely fantastic. And then at the end of it was you were talking about the absurdity in these movies. I remember seeing that on I caught the end of the movie on the cable network here in the United States, USA Network. And for years I was trying to track that movie down. I was like, where is that movie? Where can I find this movie? I think I watched like 5 or 6 Seagal DTV flicks before I finally found it. Because I just needed to see that again.
Definitely, if your listeners take anything away from this conversation, it's to go away and watch Out for a Kill. It's one of the most outrageously funny action movies you will ever see.
Yeah, it has everything you want. I mean, just even the title, right? I mean, they just essentially just take 2 Seagal movies and jam them together to make it, because he's right. Yeah, he's hard to kill or he's out for justice, one or the other. So. There's that one. And then, of course, I think we talked about Urban Justice. And there's a scene at the end of Urban Justice where he disarms somebody and then he just walks away, right? He doesn't do anything beyond that. And Eddie Griffin in the film with him just looks at him and goes, "That's gangsta." And I just love that, too, that end sequence there. You don't always get a good ending for a Seagal film. So I think you're right in pointing out the ending here because it is satisfying enough. And sometimes that helps too when a movie has elements of downtime and padding that you almost kind of forget those if you get a good enough ending that it works.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, like if a film, you're always going to be more forgiving of a film if it ends on like a kind of like a high note, because that's your last image of the film. So if your last image of the film, if the kind of final thing that you see in a film leaves a kind of good taste in your mouth, you're going to be like, you'll look back on it kind of fondly, and then like maybe a little later you'll be like, yeah, it wasn't that good, but like but just in that moment when you finish watching the film, you'll be like, oh, that was quite fun.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is enough too, if you're watching this with a group of people, that you can the story is not so complicated that you and your friends can't like talk over it. And I think that's another thing too with these Seagal movies is that if you watch them in groups, there's a lot to make fun of in these movies. There's a lot to poke fun at with him. Again with the ADR things, also the driving sequences where it's just like he's in a car and it's so obvious that he's not driving. I mean, it looks like a 60s procedural or something like that where they're driving the cop car and you just see the screen in the background. But this is 2009 and it's and this is another hallmark of what we get from Seagal later on is that he stands less and less in his films. He does more and more sit down roles. And part of what he can do in a sit down role is he can drive and just be sitting behind the wheel of a car and it works there. So we're seeing some other things that kind of become hallmarks of his movies later, and that's one of them, I think.
Right. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I deign to check them out, I will.
Yeah.
I'll certainly see that. But yes, I mean, like Seagal movies are kind of. I personally don't drink anymore. Not because I was an alcoholic or anything. I just gave it up because like I have gut issues and it wasn't worth it.
Yeah.
But he is like, he's prime kind of drinking game material, that kind of thing of like, take a shot when anytime ADR happens where it's clearly not Seagal's voice. Take a shot anytime you see a clear stunt double. Take a shot every time somebody gives like a ridiculous compliment to Seagal. And, we find out he is the greatest human who's ever lived. Yes. And we just get various details of why he's the greatest human ever lived, throughout the movie. You can always have a great time kind of doing that sort of thing with Seagal movies.
Yeah, I have the same way. I've kind of stopped drinking myself, and for a similar reason. Yeah, because I drinking kind of kind of gives me some internal issues as well. One of the things I have discovered is hop water. I don't know if that's something that you have in New Zealand, but in America here, a lot of independent labels will make like sparkling water that's made with hops, and so it has a kind of a cleaner beer taste to it. And so I think that's a great deal. It's expensive, the hop water, but doing a hop water drinking game to Seagal actually works too.
I could imagine that. I could imagine, anything.
Sure. Excellent. Well, Scott, anything else on this film that you wanted to mention?
I'm trying to think. Is there? I think we've gone through most of it. I guess like the only one of the elements that we didn't really discuss was kind of like the Detective Simon character.
Oh yes, yeah.
So like the Detective Simon character is really quite funny because of like how the character kind of switches. So the first scene we see the character is when Seagal arrives on a private plane in quote-unquote Texas, because we've seen all those establishing shots. I mean, there's like a tourism board shot of the Alamo. So it's got to be in Texas, right? So he arrives, and then like Detective Simon gives him like this stern speech, the kind of speech that you're like, he's probably a corrupt cop.
Yes.
Then the next time we see Detective Simon, he's like 10 times friendlier, and suddenly he's wanting to work with Seagal. He understands where he's coming from. He's like, talking cop to cop kind of thing. And you're like, where did this character come from?
Yeah.
He seems like when Seagal first arrived, he seemed like the racist sheriff in a horror movie, when you go to like a small town. Like that was like his vibe, like when you first see him. And then he's like white knight detective for the rest of the movie. And I was like, wait, so why was he such an ass in the first scene? What was that trying to establish?
It almost had a feeling of what I was joke up plot convenience theater, where it was almost like it was convenient for the plot for him to turn, right? Because it would have added, I guess, maybe, I don't know. I know exactly what you mean though, because he was setting up to be a certain way. And then he reveals himself to be like he's after this Jason Cross guy as well. And he kind of sees it as Seagal as somebody who can work outside the law and potentially solve his problem for him. And but also too, we lose him for huge chunks of the movie as well. It's like he's there for that scene in the beginning where Seagal gets off the plane. He's there later when he meets Seagal in town and kind of tells him what his vibe is. And even there, I don't know how you felt, but even there, I still thought maybe he was gonna be revealed to be corrupt.
He was still going to be revealed to be, yeah, because like he is very sparsely throughout the movie.
Yeah.
So the first scene we see him, he's like that, you know. He comes across as like that typical kind of small town sheriff, even though it's a big city, but you know, that kind of character. And then we see him again. I don't know, like 10, well, maybe 15 minutes later or something like that. When the home security is being fitted to the mansion. And, you know, like, again, he seems very aggressive. He's talking to some of the kind of other staff at the mansion, being like, what's all this shit? And, like, you know, and asking about, like, Seagal's character. And, I don't know. And it's like, okay, right. So, again, he seems like he might be on, like, Jason Cross's payroll or something. Or he might be corrupt in some way. And then the third scene we see him, he bumps into Seagal's character in the street. And he seems way more friendly. And it's like, okay, so he might be a good guy. And then the fourth time we see him in the police station where he shares information with him, he's like, all right, you're right. Okay, so when he met him in the street, that wasn't an act. He actually is after Jason Cross and he actually wants to get this guy. And it's like, but why did you establish his character as so aggressive? And so, like, I don't know, like, maybe they're just trying to throw out, like, I don't even understand why they would try to make him a red herring. We kind of know the players. Because we've already got Mason, we kind of know he's going to turn. You're like, yeah, okay, he's, you know. So I don't. So it just seems like an extra element that we don't need. Like we don't need like another kind of corrupt person, you know, working for the gangster because we've already got Mason.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Like it didn't add up too much. So I don't know why they made him as a kind of red herring like that, and then revealed him to be an ally. So yeah, the character was weird. And also the other thing that I really enjoyed was that character goes to visit Connor, who is Nikita's father.
Yeah.
And this is just something that they were like clearly did like one takeoff.
Yeah.
Because he like goes like, oh yeah. He mentions Detective Simon mentions something about Roland Ballinger. Now, we've been introduced to the character as Roland Salinger. On IMDb, he's listed as Roland Salinger. On the credits, he's listed as Roland Salinger. But then you think Connor is going to say to Detective Simon, it's actually Salinger, not Ballinger. You know, he's my close friend. But then Connor also refers to him as Roland Ballinger. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Obviously, they got a bit mixed up as a dud take. But I don't know. Did they not have enough time or money to do like a second take? Just say Roland Salinger. You said the wrong name.
Right. And the other thing with that character, with that Kevin Wiggins is the actor who plays him, he is exceedingly lantern-jawed and chiseled. And there's a feeling like a guy like that should be used in more of a way, right? Like either he should be confronting Seagal, fighting Seagal, or fighting somebody, right? Like if he was going to be a good guy and not be a red herring, then he should be helping Seagal in a way, right? He should be knocking guys out and punching people and shooting people. And the fact that like he's presented as this extreme lantern giant. I mean, you know, he cuts a huge figure in this suit that he's in. He looks like someone who could take care of business, and he's just barely in the movie. And I kind of wonder too if that character was supposed to have a bigger part, and part of the Seagal rewrite might have been to diminish that character so Seagal could have more of the glory. But he was kind of wasted, it felt like to me.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I was really surprised that he had really nothing to do with the kind of final shootout and battle. So like obviously before we get to the chase and fight with the kind of head henchman Tory, Seagal takes a bunch of people out, kind of just like knifes them in the back because they have Jason Cross has these like snipers at different places, and he kind of stealthily takes out the snipers, and then he starts shooting people, more of Jason Cross's men. And I thought that either that character was being set up of being like, yeah, one of those characters, one of those kind of like, boss level characters that he would have to fight, so maybe fight him and fight Tori or something like that. Or, now it's revealed to be an ally. There's like a team up in the end, and yeah, maybe he doesn't get, maybe it doesn't really make sense for him to get involved in the action beforehand. But for that kind of final siege, as the kind of kidnap exchange is going down, you'd think he'd be involved in that. And they even kind of set it up like that because Detective Simon gets this note of be at Cross Ranch at 8:00.
Right.
And you're like, okay, this Detective Simon guy and Seagal, they're going to team up. They're going to create mayhem. And yeah, and it's kind of weird that doesn't happen. And even the people he does team up with, because we didn't really mention that the driver kind of gets in on the action, and the brothers to the Allegra, who was the one who was harassed earlier on in the movie, they kind of come and get involved to try and snipe a few people off. But yeah, they get like, I think you see them shoot like one person each, and then the rest of the action's all handled by Seagal's character. So like, and I don't know like how much of that is like Seagal's creative input of like, no, I got to be the main focal period focused for this. I can't be teaming up with Detective Simon and these. I don't even think the Mexican brothers get names. They're just like,
no.
These are Allegra's brothers. And so that I'm really not trying to be racist when I say Mexican brothers. They're just like, they are just referred to as Allegra's brothers, and that's it. Yeah, if I remember right, I think the driver is named Manuelo. So I think he is at least given a name. But again, I think he shoots like one guy, and that's it. So like Seagal, not for team ups in this era.
Oh right, yeah, no, he's definitely not doing that. Yeah, he's definitely doing his own like. Yeah, I do think there was probably room for more of that, and it didn't happen. I mean, in terms of like you talk about with the Mexican characters in the film, there is almost like that sense because like there's a hint that the Jason Cross character is a white supremacist, and that's part of the reason why Kevin Wiggins' character, Detective Simon, wants to take down Jason Cross, is that he's forming a separatist group. And again, that's even something else that's like just barely hinted at, right? But there's no real mention of any kind of racism. In fact, if there's any racism, the film itself kind of depicts the Mexican characters in the sense of like they're loyal servants, like that like the characters in the film.
I think like that's one of those weird things. Is like I think that's also kind of like a Seagal trope,
right?
Where this is a thing that like I didn't notice when I was younger, but I did notice when I grew up, kind of thing. When I was younger, I thought Seagal was cool because he looked badass, and I also thought Seagal was cool because he was an ally to the underdog, and in kind of various kind of native people and people, ethnic minorities and stuff like that. But if you look back on those films, it's like he is a bad ally. He is like so like he is very much like fulfilling the white savior narrative of being like, yes, I care about you people, but you can't really do things yourself. So I'm just going to fluff your hair and, do the things that need to be done. And it's like, he's like, it's so condescending. Like, fuck you.
right, exactly. Yeah. And this movie definitely has that vibe in it, but what it does is it tries to set it up, make it seem like it's more benevolent because it's trying to set it off against this white supremacist character who, again, they don't really do anything about him being a white supremacist, which is it's just like, again, it's like this other thing just sort of thrown out there, but it's not really a thing. So yeah, and again, that kind of gets to that point you were talking about with like the Mexican characters not always having names. Is that they're just the Mexican brothers? It's sort of like but they're loyal, like they perform their job admirably. They're loyal servants in that sense, which is a horrible thing to say. That's how the movie's depicting them in a lot of cases, and it's Yeah, it's not a great. It's something, I was watching a Western with my wife because on Saturdays here in the U.S. there's a retro channel, MeTV, that does Westerns kind of in the Saturday afternoon thing, and that's a trope that you see all the time, right? Is that you either have the vile kind of depraved minority characters who just do horrible things, or you have that loyal servant type of character who there's evil racist people in the film or in the show, and the main character is not racist, but he's not racist in the sense that like Seagal's not racist here in this sense of like, well, if you do your job well, I'm good with you, but don't start thinking like you should be the star of the movie, right? Kind of that kind of thing. Yeah. It's sort of what happens with Seagal's, but like you said, he's not always he seems like a great advocate when he really isn't.
Yeah, no, he's really quite a poor advocate, because of the kind of just the kind of weird condescendingness, and like the kind of well, as we kind of discussed about the kind of cultural appropriation thing of just being like he likes to put on these fake accents and like pretend to be like that type of person in like a kind of goofy and kind of slightly insulting way. So yeah, and yeah, I think that's another thing I didn't quite understand about the villain character, Jason Cross. I'm not quite. If they were like making him a white supremacist, that's it's perfectly legitimate. Make him a white supremacist, but like they don't really, like you say, they just don't make it part of the plot.
Right.
Like other characters mentioned like twice that he's a white supremacist, but in terms of like what we see of the character, it's just like a guy who's just a gangster. He does drug deals. He likes to fix boxing fights, whatever. I was like, okay, well, if you're going to make that the point of the movie, like, I mean, that's great. You want to make like an anti-racist movie that's, being an ally, that's, that's taking down white supremacists. Cool. I watch it, but like actually make it part of the movie. Like I don't understand why they've just thrown it in here, because it's like, it's just like a kind of weird thinking of like, what do we know about Texas? Oh, racism. We'll throw racism in it. It's like, and I'm genuinely not shitting on like I know that not all Texans are racist or anything. No, I'm perfectly aware. But like, it's just like it seems like they're just playing to a stereotype of like, of course there's going to be. Yeah, the gangster's also going to be a white supremacist because it's set in Texas. It just feels like they're just throwing it out there for like a stereotypical thing.
Yeah, I think this might have been the unevenness from Seagal, like because you talked about how this is a trope that sort of comes up in his movies. I think he wrote it into this movie, and it made the film uneven as a result. I think he just sort of stuck this in there. I think if this had been one of his big budget productions, the movie probably would have been 2 hours. And I mean, because you actually think about a movie called the Patriot that he did in the mid '90s, his first direct-to-video movie that he kind of tried to strike out on his own. That one did involve white supremacists who were a separatist group. So I think he may have wanted to try to go there, but he just, the movie, they wanted to keep it scant, and it was like, well, I need more scenes where I'm playing lovely uncle, that's not related to this girl. Scenes where these touching scenes where she's telling me how she remembers me giving her some trinket from Thailand or something, and we have our touching moments together where we're almost making a love connection, but we're not. He wanted more of those scenes instead of scenes of the main bad guy maybe like talking about his white supremacist ideas and maybe indoctrinating his followers or that kind of thing.
Yeah. Which, in the right hands, would have been would have made a very interesting movie. Unfortunately, it was not in the right hands.
Right.
So I would, yes. We've kind of given our opinion on this movie. It's kind of middling. Don't necessarily, go out your way to seek it out. But if you do stumble across it, it's a perfectly fine way to spend 90 minutes if you're into Seagal action. Yeah. Definitely go and check out for a Kill because it's hilarious. Do not don't bother with The Patriot. If you're an action fan, don't bother with The Patriot. It's an incredibly dry drama that has barely any action in it, And because it relies on Seagal's acting, a film, nothing, films just shouldn't do that. It's hard. It's hard to get through. We reviewed it in all 90s action all the time. I've watched it twice in my life, which is this is hard. And it's a lot of just like Seagal looking through a microscope in a lab on a loop.
Yeah.
And it goes on for what seems like forever, but I think it's only 90 minutes long.
It's not a long one. The one thing that it had going for it, at least that I thought, was the nice backdrop of Montana. You get these really nice mountainscapes there, but it has the distinction of being his first direct-to-video movie. But then what's interesting, right, is he has Exit Wounds 3 years later, and Exit Wounds is like this rebound for him, where he suddenly finds box office success again, tries to recapture it with Half Past Dead, doesn't work, and then where we find him here in 2009, he's sufficiently direct-to-video at this point. He's, he gets a scene in he gets a small part in Machete, but yeah, I think you're right about The Patriot. I think it's, it has that distinction of being his first direct-to-video movie, but it doesn't have the wild goofiness. There is a wild goofy aspect to it, but it doesn't play out the way that like it does like in Out for a Kill or something like that.
The only good thing I will say about The Patriot is that L.Q. Jones is fun in the movie. He is by far the best thing in the movie. Sadly, he's not in the whole movie. But like anytime he's on the screen, the film is much, much more fun. So yes, L.Q. Jones. If you're going to watch it, you've just got L.Q. Jones, and that's it.
Yeah, and L.Q. Jones a lot of times plays bad guys, and so you get to see him as a good guy here, which is more fun as well. I agree with you there. I think I love him in Casino. I love that part he plays there. And actually, my wife, again, watching the Retro Channel, he was on a Waltons episode, and I was like, oh, that's L.Q. Jones. And she was like, what? And of course, she's usually telling me something else while these shows are on in the room, and my attention just drifts to what's on the TV. And so she was telling me something else, and I was like, "Oh, that's L.Q. Jones." And she was like, "I was talking about," it's like so. So my mind kind of drifts if I see L.Q. Jones on the screen, kind of like what you're talking about. Yeah, he's going to pull my attention.
Yeah. Well, I gotta say that the last time I was on the podcast, we did talk about the World Cup for quite a long time. And I don't know, maybe your listeners didn't think they got enough bang for their buck. And we did talk about some other stuff, including some random beer chat at the start of the episode. But I mean, I feel like we did review The Keeper, and we gave mini reviews for about 6 other Seagal movies. So like, I feel like we gave value for money definitely this time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think at the very least we gave people a good watch list if they haven't gotten into a lot of direct-to-video Seagal for sure. But yeah, so yeah, Scott, if you want, as we're wrapping up here, anything that you want to plug or tell people where they can find you?
Yeah. So my first podcast, the one that I do myself, is called New Horror Express. It can be found kind of wherever you find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, some of the smaller ones, Castbox, whatever. Yeah, anywhere. And also you can find that on my website, newhorrorexpress.com. Basically, that podcast is primarily an interview podcast where I interview horror movie directors, actors, screenwriters. I even talked to like a horror film festival director once. All sorts of people who are working in kind of present day horror. It's very much kind of 21st century focused. So like, yeah, that's that one that comes out fortnightly usually. And the other one is all 90s action all the time, which is kind of gone through a little bit of a format change. It started off that we looked at like a different action star and their output during the 90s. So we did different seasons. And so the original 4 seasons, we did Seagal, we did Stallone, we did Kurt Russell, and we did Val Kilmer. We've kind of changed the format now. So going from this year forward, it's going to be a monthly podcast, and we're going to look at the kind of films of 30 years previous. So for this year of 2023, we will be looking at films that came out in 1993, and we'll be doing that kind of each month. We've released the first 2 episodes already, which are I'm just trying to remember now. It's only just happened. We did City Hunter in. Oh no, actually, the second episode actually doesn't come out until the next week. Or I think around the same time this episode might come out. So our first episode in January was City Hunter. We've got an episode coming out very soon on American Yakuza. And then, we're looking at other 1993 films. And you can find that on Anchor, and again, wherever you find podcasts, and also on the Last of the Action Heroes network. And I think that's all the plugs I can think of.
All right, excellent. Yeah. I know for me, because I do, I've got an iPhone, so I just subscribe to everything on iTunes, and it's great because when you subscribe to a podcast now, with I've got a nicer iPhone now than I used to have. It actually gives me notification when the new episode comes up. So I'm like, oh, there it is, the new all 90s action, or the new Horror Express. So that's a great way. Definitely people should check those out. I was on with City Hunter with you, and it was a lot of fun. I think looking back at movies that way, I think we just did a movie from 2009. Actually, it's interesting. Both times we've been on, we've done a movie from 2009, and there is some bit of past there, but it's much more fun to kind of go back 30 years and talk about some of the differences in how films were made, but also culturally how things were different then.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that in the episodes of the kind of cultural differences and what was seen as appropriate in the 90s and what's not seen as appropriate now, and that kind of thing. We in case that is off-putting to some people, we don't get too far into the into the long grass in that area. We do mainly focus on the film, but me and my co-hosts generally think it's important to give that kind of cultural placement as well, and kind of talk about some of the elements that might not fly now or whatever, because we think that kind of leads to interesting conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And even when I was on your podcast and we talked about Batman Returns, it was interesting to talk about the comic book movie industry as it was at that time versus what it is now. And you don't really think about it. You think about what you're experiencing now as this is how it is. But comic book movies were treated so differently back then. So even that was like a really cool conversation that we kind of were talking about there, and sort of what people expected from a comic book movie at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can, we talk about that sort of stuff that's kind of lighter cultural context stuff as well. So like you say, comic book movies in the early 90s, studios didn't really know what to do with them. It was a very nascent thing. It wasn't the kind of predominant form of film entertainment that you were getting in the cinema, and it was kind of seen as it's very looked down upon in a way that it's not now. And again, it is interesting to look at these cultural differences. When I was growing up in the 90s, if you were a comic book nerd, you were an outsider. Right. Now, if you're into comic books, you're in the mainstream. Right. It's very, the way it was looked upon is just completely different. And for people who are older than 30, it's very confusing.
Yes,
you were picked on for being the kid in the corner reading the Spider-Man comic in the 90s. Now nobody cares. Everybody's you're reading, because Spider-Man's everywhere. Who doesn't love Spider-Man? But it was very different. It was very different in the 90s. So we talk about that kind of stuff as well, of being just being like, yes, cultural attitudes to things have changed in many, many regards.
Yeah, it is. It's a really interesting thing, and so yeah, definitely people should check those out. I think they're. I definitely enjoy listening, and of course, I've enjoyed being on as well. It was fun to be able to chat. But yeah, as we're kind of wrapping this one up, Scott, thank you again for coming on. This was a really fun conversation. I think with Seagal, he's always a good second topic after Lundgren when you're on for the second time.
Well, I'm really glad you had me back on. This has been a great conversation. I've had a lot of fun chatting to you. And yeah, if you ever want me back on again, I'm usually willing to talk about just about anything.
Well, we've got plenty of other action stars from here that we've got. So, and there's plenty of movies out there too. So we got plenty of topics. So we'll definitely reconnect again. But yeah, thanks again, Scott, for coming on, and thank you everyone for listening. And yeah, we'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.
Direct